if you play your cards right, so to say, and you're trying to do this sort of thing as a government, which would prevent you from ever being proven under the current auspices that you did a genocide, even though you literally did one. You can kind of sort of nerd emoji your way out of it through pedantry by saying, but specifically, I didn't pull the trigger. That person did, and it's a shame that he did, because he didn't have that order. That order was given by this guy, who I never even talked to, and already when you are. It's also cool if you aren't feeling up to today, given the insomnia. No, it's okay. The insomnia is not going anywhere, so it might as well be to now. It might as well be right now. Go ahead and hop into the Discord. Go into the call-ins and debates section. I can give you at least like 15, 20 minutes, because I don't think I'll have too much to say. I'll just pump you for information. Talking to Red. And if anything, if I fuck up, it's more just why do you guys all just hop in? You could just watch the fucking stream, you dorks. None of you are coming in here except for the one person. Everybody just immediately jumps. It's only one person that's coming in. They just all filling up the area. Yeah, I have the Collins area for Ren open, but Ren, you better be on the fucking Discord. I think you are, obviously. There you go.
Cool. And does it sound all right?
You're a little loud.
Oh, sorry. That's probably just my voice, if I'm being honest.
No, it's okay. Don't worry about it. We got about to figure it out. Go ahead and keep talking. Actually, introduce yourself. Do the whole thing. Name, pronouns.
Yeah. My name is Ren. I use he, him, or they, them. I essentially originally made my sort of request to talk because I had mentioned at some point in one of your streams that I knew a bit about like deconstructing making a solid argument for why the current definition of genocide as it pertains to the international judicial system isn't really all that sound.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really much of a debate. It was more just something that I know enough about that I figured I could help like give some solid sort of points to rebuke a lot of what people say when they're like, it's not a genocide, and when they try to use this argument that, that's not how we classify genocide, etc., etc. So the links I sent you are actually just like my citations, my sources, essentially. And it was more to have so that you could know where I was getting my information from and see, that it was, essentially you would be able to fact check me.
Gotcha. Yeah. And thank you. I'm glad it's not it wasn't a debate, because I would have to be like, I didn't prepare.
Yeah.
Let me start off with one question I have that I think is a good one to get into, because it's sort of a question I have, and it sort of kind of gets pushed into things that other people say, and that is, why is a definition for genocide valuable? Like, where does the value of that come from, aside from just being able to obviously like literally articulate something?
The value of a genocide as a definition, as a concept, is in the courts, in the criminal courts. There are different, essentially, the crime of committing a genocide has more teeth to it and has a different set of rules as it pertains to how people are processed and prosecuted. And and it's also that it serves as an important, um, essentially as an important signifier that this isn't just about like not wanting the like someone in your territory or deciding that you want a territory and like because I know there are some iffy lines between ethnic cleansing and genocide, but the idea is that you are wanting to destroy the group in whole or in part, meaning that it's not just that you don't want them around you, it's that you don't want them around anyone.
Hmm.
You know, it's that
So
you fundamentally have sort of like a disagreement with who they are as like
yes.
people.
So would you say that there's an obvious distinction between what we would say, I guess, in a legal sense, de facto genocide, where it's genocide as a fact, like it's just literally like, okay, that's a fucking genocide, clearly, but then de jure genocide, the legal genocide, you haven't quite fulfilled the obligations to a specific court body to prosecute an act of genocide.
Yes, yes.
And so those probably, I would guess, obviously on that, you would have to say, well, if there is somebody, the possibility of a de facto genocide and then a de jure genocide informs the legal 1, 2, 3, the legal line of there is therefore probably legal genocide, which is maybe what's happening. So, like, basically, you have fulfilled all of the aspects of genocide or trying to achieve a genocide. However, the courts can't prosecute you because you're still within the bounds of legality when it comes to the genocide you're doing. Is that a possible explanation for things that maybe are happening where we have this like kind of back and forth?
Yes, and actually that's, sort of the fundamental of, what, like, what my points are, because often when you get people who are talking about, like, "Well, it's not a genocide, like, legally it hasn't met these requirements," I think often we get caught up in, like, trying to say, "No, it does meet those requirements," when there's already a fundamental issue with the like current legal definition of genocide
Mm-hmm.
in general.
For me,
Um, oh,
just to talk about the limitations of it, and I'm trying to also kind of maybe hopefully direct you to teaching me things that I want to learn. It seems that genocide is kind of unique as a legal distinction in that when you compare it to other capital crimes, so to say, that an individual can commit, almost in every legal system I've seen basically on the earth, with some notable exceptions, there are gradations within distinction for even the most extreme of capital crimes. So there's very often or very seldomly a specific instance of, say, murder, right? Where you're like, okay, there is or is not a murder happening here. You have more along the lines of murder one, which is murder, and then you have negligent homicide, you have non-intentional negligent homicide, and a series of gradations
or
that
like murder
accommodate.
with
Oh, sorry.
premeditation. Oh, I was just gonna say, or like murder that's premeditated versus, like in the moment murders are
Yes.
sometimes classified as different crimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be the versions of homicides of negligent homicide and intentional homicide are aspects of that where I have covered stuff. It's actually very different, but those legal gradations give you the ability. I think this is very similar to the Kyle Rittenhouse case when we talk about that. It's kind of just this where the semantic, specific, highly pedantic definitions of something lead people into believing that it is a basically a true false state. There's a binary. It's there either is or is not a genocide in Bossing, say, to bring this to an internet jokey aspect. Is that the case? That it's like we actually need gradations for this because clearly what's happening in Israel is not literally the end 1945 Holocaust. Where it was established. We've got full government funding for the end of what was an attempted literal annihilation of a people. Here, we're earlier in the process. So if you stop someone now, you have not maybe committed genocide specifically with the relativistic, notion of this is a genocide based on the genocides that we're used to, the Holocaust, the one that happened in Thailand, things like that. We're at, genocide 3. Intention to commit, however, interrupted from finishing an ethnic cleansing.
Well, I think I'm going to separate it from at the very least my understanding of the legal interpretation and sort of the social interpretation, if you will, because legally, um, one does not have to have um, one does not have to be at those end steps for it to be a um, for instance, that's actually something that's frequently mentioned in a lot of judgment rulings because they'll talk through. I'm sure, given your reporting with criminal things before, that you're familiar with the way that sometimes judgments will take you through everything that um, they considered as it pertains to different laws and
Yes.
applications
Can I
and
can I explain this for the audience real quick so they know?
yeah.
So, if you guys have never been part of a jury trial, you don't just say it's murder and then you kind of go off of it. At the beginning of every trial, the judge specifically will articulate the circumstances that must have occurred in order for you to select for a murder conviction, and then says when they give you your evidence, you have to do it. So they'll lay out 3 things. This must be a premeditated act. Someone must have died. And the person who did the premeditated act must be the person who killed the person who died. And so, they'll tell you those 3 things have to be accomplished. More complicated laws might have 15, 150, who the hell knows, little things that have to be specified in order for that law to have been broken. If you don't actually get all of them, then the law has not been broken. So if somebody died and it was a premeditated act, but the guy is not the guy that did it, then that guy didn't commit murder. I know it seems simplistic, but they do lay those out. So I think that's where we're going to get into. I'm pass back to Ren.
Yeah, and it's and in these cases, obviously, because there is not a jury in the same way, it's a panel of judges making this call. They will write out the evidence that the essentially prosecution and defense have given for each case, and we'll talk about the precedent, how things should be interpreted. So, for instance, there's actually been quite a lot of conversation surrounding intent, and when does it cross that sort of line, along with the funding, government funding, specifically with the oh god, I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation of it. The Bosnia Herzegovina.
You got it. You just said it
Um,
slow.
yeah, Bosnian genocide. Um, because in that case there was a pseudo government, the government was very much not firm as it pertains to the people who committed the genocide. Um, and while there was clear signs of encouragement,
Mm-hmm.
the ICJ essentially, even legal scholars call it a mixed message as it pertains to how they ruled it.
That
Because
seems.
they,
Oh,
oh, sorry.
sorry. Yeah, I kind of get it. I'm just listening to what you're saying. I feel like now having you even just kind of illuminated that, and please keep a pin in where you're going to continue. It does seem like that might be repeatedly the case, because when I compare the closest obvious comparison between genocide and the standard legal system that affects the individual as opposed to the state is that you can very easily, much more easily, even though it's actually one of the most difficult things to do, establish mens rea or whatever, guilty mind, criminal intent of an individual, because an individual is an individual. They are a holistic creature with their own individual motivations and stuff. Where as a country, you do have the difficulty of trying to piece out, what percentage of the country is on board with something. If you have something like a monarch or a true dictator who is like an established, you have like literally a Putin, and Putin is saying to do stuff, then you can kind of blame his state. But the more democratic sort of obfuscation that you have, it does seem like it'll be much more difficult to possibly impossible to really nail down this was the specific singular and holistic intent of a government to do this thing, as opposed to a series of missteps, one intentional thing, and then a lot of like wishy-washy floating around. This guy misunderstood, that guy misunderstood. It does seem like it is, and this might even be the case with Israel, possibly very easy for higher level people to pawn off responsibility for something just on the sheer incompetence of their underlings by saying, like, I have no idea why they thought that they should bomb that tent city. I just said I wanted it moved. They seemed to interpret it as drop 15,000 pounds of firebomb on it. So please continue. I don't know if I just wanted to throw that out there. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh no, you're totally fine. But yeah, so when the ICJ wound up ruling on the Bosnia v Serbia essentially case, they determined that the Serbian government had violated one of the articles in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, but it was the article where they had an obligation to prevent and punish the crime of genocide.
Mm-hmm.
However, they said that the government was not itself responsible nor complicit in the genocide. And it's also notable that when the ICJ determined that a genocide had taken place, it determined that only one massacre, I believe it was. I'll quickly double check. Yeah, it was that there was a genocide committed by the Bosnian Serb army, the VRS, in the Bosnian town of Srebrenica in July 1995.
Mm-hmm.
But
is that a distinct army within the state that's like separate? Like, do they have do you make that distinction just to say like that's the name of the state's army, or does the army have?
It was a quote. I was about to give you the. This is from the. It's sorry. It is the State Responsibility for Genocide, a follow-up by Marco Milano in the European Journal of International Law back in 2007. And so it was just like giving a quick rundown of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah, essentially, my full understanding, like I have done research into what was going on in Serbia at the time, but I'm not entirely sure exactly how their military was working. But essentially, it was in the midst of a sort of civil war with Bosnian Serb, with the Bosnian Serb army as a secessionist republic within the Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm so sorry that I keep messing that one up.
Herzegovina is, I believe, how it's said. Herzegovina.
Okay, yes, I'm not gonna do. Yeah, that's one of those words.
No, it's fine. You can just say like BH if you want. Bosnia. You can just also just say Bosnia.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna opt for that one.
Okay.
But yeah, so essentially, it was a militant group, but they that were trying to come into power, but they weren't fully in power. I mean, the army was if I recall correctly, it was from a bunch of other groups that had sort of lost or had fallen apart. So it's like a coalescence.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, that entire area was in a lot of turmoil around the 1990s. And essentially, the reason there's like this distinction is because a part of why they were determined to not have as much culpability, the state as a whole, was because of the sort of lack of genuine control and power and governmental like faculties. Um, if you'll give me a second, you can make a comment while I'm looking this up. I remember within my citations that I actually have one that talks specifically about why they were considered to not be um, like essentially in a state power in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this definitely like confuddles things up. I'm thinking about it more. I feel like there can be this kind of just proves to me, really, is what I'm trying to get to, that there needs to be a very distinct and articulated expression of genocide as both an intentional and unintentional act, because it does seem that here that there's a very large window of plausible deniability that's created by giving governments the ability to say, well, we didn't intend for a genocide to happen, and then thus, you know, we can wash away all the sins of these few months, these few years, these few decades, whatever, what have you. Whereas, and lets you kind of create a situation where you don't have to be culpable for anything. And I think,
And that wasn't always how it was. It was, in fact, with like this it was with this combined with a precedent set by, I believe it was Nicaragua v. United States,
mm-hmm,
because Nicaragua wanted to have like essentially they charged that the United States had aided in the like genocide slash massacre that the like guerrilla I believe it was like people essentially incited by COINTELPRO.
mm-hmm,
Um, and essentially that the Nicaraguan government was saying that because of the fact that like the U.S. was the one who like got these people militarized and armed and what have you, that they should bear some responsibility for the massacres that occurred.
yeah,
And the courts found that they couldn't be liable for what guerrilla um, militants did, essentially, because the U.S. government was not directly like telling them to commit these massacres.
yeah, which is a an exception that existed in American state law as well. Is why we have RICO statutes. This is an issue. It's kind of fascinating that we're even having this conversation again. Not me and you specifically, but just like the world in general, because we've already established in American case law that it is quite impossible without a specific framework of legislation that is meant and developed to address organizational crime as opposed to non-organizational crime, that you cannot punish very often the actors that do stuff. Which is why back in the day we had criminal actors, right? We had the mafia, specifically the Italian-American mafia, was able to put off criminal culpability for actions by basically saying, I literally didn't do them. So you'd have to tie them to crazy stuff. That's why you had to arrest somebody like Al Capone on tax charges. Because Al Capone could say, I had a guy go kill someone, right? Hey, you know, I need you to take care of this problem. They never say specifically, I want you to go kill somebody. So it's not conspiracy to commit murder. It's just a guy that happened to work with me, happened to do a thing, and that thing happened to be a very tragic event. So you have that sort of like slimy mob talk, right? The way to address that is the RICO statutes, Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act, right? Some people think it's only racketeering. It's not. It's basically establishing that there is a ongoing organization that is a non-governmental organization, and that organization participates in criminal activity that the entire pyramid of it, profits from or organizes to create. And RICO is, without exception, it does step on people's individual freedoms more than other laws do, but also it is kind of the only way to approach it. And it does seem that a lot of what ends up becoming ethnic cleansing, genocide, and a lot of what I would call tragedies of state is the best way to describe it in my mind, where you can say no one specifically did this. We did not have, genocide. Joe Biden did not specifically do this thing. However, there was always a system in place where, this singular design would end up creating this issue. It might not even be necessarily something like genocide. Say you have a country that mass pollutes into a country that's next to it by never fixing slop dams on pig pens, and these pig pen slop dams end up spilling into a river. It poisons this entire country that's next door. They can say, well, no one intentionally tried to do that, right? But it was as an act of negligence, informed negligence, as in we told you that you're being negligent about this, and then you're not stopping the issue. That act of informed negligence, this sort of tragedy of state, can't be blamed on a singular person, but it is very much the issue and the fault of the state. And the state's sovereign power is both at fault for permitting the systems to exist which perpetrated the act, and also for not putting in position the systems to prevent the act from occurring any further. I think that would probably be the best way to address things like this. And more than likely, why the conversation is being forced down this path of singular individual responsibility. We must find if we don't have a Hitler, we don't have a Germany 1945. It's who knows who did it. You know what I mean? You have to have this specific cabal of orchestrators. Otherwise, maybe nothing happened actually. And it's all just a series of tragedies which no one is responsible for. And therefore no culpability has to be assigned, no reparations paid, no future protections established for these people. I think I might be rambling a bit at this point, but that seems to be my assessment of what seems to be happening. I don't know how accurate that might be.
Could you clarify, when you say no one's responsible, blah blah blah, all of that, etc. Are you saying that that's how people are viewing it, or are you saying that that's the legal lens?
I'm saying that no one's responsible, as in literally from a legal standpoint. Motive, opportunity, intent, and causality cannot be established for various reasons of basically being, one step away from each aspect of that. One guy says, I want a thing to happen, does nothing else. Another guy does the thing because a third guy tells him to do it, and so you have this sort of telephone game of culpability in which at no point can all four, in this case, at no point can all four of the causes, okay, this guy is definitely guilty of it, be established for an individual. By spreading the crime out amongst 4, 5, 10, 15, 150, 10,000 different people, you now have a point where you can't singularly prove that one person did all of the things, if you play your cards right, so to say, and you're trying to do this sort of thing as a government, which would prevent you from ever being proven under the current auspices that you did a genocide, even though you literally did one. You can kind of sort of nerd emoji your way out of it through pedantry by saying, but specifically, I didn't pull the trigger. That person did, and it's a shame that he did, because he didn't have that order. That order was given by this guy, who I never even talked to, and if you sit down and over the course of 15 years, you finally manage to, saw through the Gordian knot of communiques and destroyed paperwork and this, that, and the other, you can finally maybe tie these people together. In the meantime, you haven't been able to do anything about stopping the slaughter of people on the ground. I feel like that is intentionally the way that these states that are trying to skirt the genocide law through these conversations, both Israel and other nations abroad, fucking mine. I don't know why I'm talking so high and mighty. They're trying to keep that mens rea, that intentionality, that singular person being responsible for it, because that would create a situation where more often than not, no one could ever prove really that the genocide was happening underneath that legal auspice, because you can constantly telephone game culpability around to a point where it sort of just becomes baked in that we're doing something, and no one person or one small cabal of people is provably the ones that did it. That was a lot of talking on my part, and this I'm not an expert on this. This is just my impression of things from the outside. Please
Oh no,
continue.
you're fine. And I mean, mind you, like while obviously I did do significant research, I don't want to present myself as someone who has like a degree in this or anything. I'm just someone who um much earlier, like before this all even happened, I had already actually been researching things surrounding our current legal framework of genocide, because in our current legal framework, um, it is pretty much impossible for disabled people to have a genocide committed against them.
Yeah, I saw that as part of your
Yeah.
notes. You want to speak more to
Yes.
that?
Yeah. So essentially, one of the frameworks for like whether something is or isn't a genocide is actually that they have to fall into like the people who have been killed have to fall into a certain group.
Mm-hmm.
They have essentially like four different categories. It's they must be um either, let me see. Sorry, I'm pulling up the UN document so I can just read it. Um, that it was, in whole or in part a, group, that is a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group.
Mm-hmm.
So the
So there's no real distinction made for the various forms of undesirables, so to say, in ethnicity undesirables that might pop up in other cultures. So if you have, say, the
they've
Indians
actually,
from forever ago killing off a bunch of the untouchable type people, that would not be covered.
it would actually be covered because of the Rwandan genocide case law.
Okay.
Because
Can
when
you
they,
explain the on the ground circumstances of that for people that might not have
um
seen it?
So, the Rwandan genocide occurred, when the two major ethnic groups, the Tutsis and the Hutu, essentially were at odds for quite a long time. It was essentially in the middle of a civil war between them, um, and essentially there was for a long time, a lot of buildup where the Hutu military and political leaders had been like, uh, essentially like over the radio, implanting these ideas that like the Tutsis were, bad, no good, blah, 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 just this increase in like, othering.
Mm-hmm.
And, essentially as the Civil War started to heat up, um, the, um, the Hutu, sort of, like a political, like, the, started recruiting like civilians and others to essentially go around and, just indiscriminately kill Tutsis. Um, and it was mainly like there was one guy who essentially orchestrated a lot of it with a couple of other people, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
He had taken power in the country following, the previous guy's death. And essentially there it was organized and then it fell into like disorder, but by the end, like a lot of Tutsis were dead.
Yeah, it was
And
a sudden pogrom overnight, right? Basically.
yeah, I actually had a teacher who, like, back when I was in college, she was, like, there when it
Hmm.
happened. Like, she had to hide from people with machetes. Um, and yeah, it was essentially just, like it was, like, one day everything just got way worse.
And
And
so that established that sub ethnicities within an ethnicity within a nation actually can be considered part of that for genocide. But still, we don't have protections against disabled people
yeah,
specifically. Is it just specifically
it's
disabled people?
it, it's more that the requirement is that it is a like for instance for an ethnic or racial group specifically, because obviously national or religious doesn't quite fit the same framework as when it comes to like disabled people. You know, disabled people are not going to be grouped or othered in the same way as like Christians or like Muslims or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, if we take the like ethnic or racial part of it, the core feature, and this is true for all four of them, but they really concentrated on the ethnic slash racial bit for the Rwandan like genocide essentially judgment,
Mm-hmm.
and it was that you have to have belonged to that group from birth, or where it would be the kind of thing where like the other group would see you as having been there from birth.
Gotcha. So
It's
you
that
you
like
wouldn't even get, so if you just like literally rounded up, for instance, everybody of a political group and killed them,
yeah,
you would actually
explicitly political people are excluded. Like
hmm,
political groups are excluded.
that seems that seems non-conducive to an act of genocide. That seems more like, hey, we got to make sure got to make sure we keep that line open for ourselves.
Yeah, that was actually and back in the very like first writings of the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. The very first couple drafts, I believe, actually did include political groups, and it was purposefully taken out. I don't quite remember exactly why at this particular moment, but but I do know that it was highly contentious, shall we say. And it meant that like when these like ICJ judges are like looking back, um, they will often take into account things like essentially you could almost call it like original intent or original interpretation in many regards,
Mm-hmm.
or what they think it is. And so you know that's going to already bias them to not want to include political groups. Um, but yes, disabled people have been explicitly excluded um, in many regards. While we now have a like charter on disabled rights, I believe, that says that like all disabled, essentially like all disabled people deserve to not be sad. It doesn't have like any teeth to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, if I were to give some conjecture, a personal belief on why it is that disabled people have not been included in these categories.
Mm-hmm.
It would, I personally think it would probably have to do with the fact that then the US would have to have explicitly been like guilty of genocide, because back in the like oh god, like essentially the eugenics movement,
Mm-hmm.
there were laws in place that allowed you to like forcibly sterilize disabled people.
Mm-hmm.
There were ugly laws that prevented disabled people from like being allowed like out in public. There was a concentrated effort to prevent disabled people from procreating. Um, and I mean, the US and a lot of other countries, not many countries have been nice to their disabled people. Um, were probably less willing to include disabled people as a protected group, because even back in the like 40s, 50s when this was being made, like ugly laws were still in place.
Yeah.
Um, force forced sterilization laws were still in place. I believe as recent as 1970s, there were like thousands of Californian disabled people or like Native Americans who were falsely described as being disabled who were forcibly sterilized.
Mm-hmm.
It's also technically still somewhat legal in the US. The difference is now, and it's only some states, you essentially, a judge can't just say, without anyone else, like without a guardian, sterilize them, because that was what they used to do. Like if someone had a criminal record because they were, I don't know, like they had a disability that made them act out. That person could be sterilized with only the judge saying so. But nowadays, essentially, you have to have the person has to be in a guardianship,
Mm-hmm.
and then the guardian can actually request to a judge that they be sterilized. Technically, Britney Spears was, though not permanently sterilized, was forcibly sterilized when she was forced on birth control because she was in a guardianship.
That's very strange.
Yeah. Um.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
say that that's clearly a fucking violation of rights. It does seem like that's trying to intentionally keep some loopholes in for pretty dark purposes. Because I think
And again, that's just
if you
personal
pass a law,
conjecture.
if you pass a law outlawing, whatever, no more Native Americans can step foot inside Oklahoma, right? Obviously, that is an act of genocide. It's an act of, at least at minimum, ethnic cleansing. Because even though it's not, we're going to kill all the Native Americans in Oklahoma, they can't legally be there. So if they are there, it's in violation of the law and you can use state power to remove them. That's kind of how you start off with one of these things. You can, however, if that's not illegal, you could, at least maybe not in our country, First Amendment would prevent this at all. So it's not that big of a deal technically, unless they manage to legalize it in a way that would circumvent the First Amendment of the Constitution. But if you were in a different country that did not have First Amendment rights, like fucking Britain, you could, technically speaking, illegalize a political party from
Well, I
existing,
mean,
and
the
and
U.S.
that
did
would kind of,
that.
if that political party was tied to the ethnicity of people to some degree, it would be kind of pushing into the same reasons and intents that people have for genocide. You would still be trying to achieve the same thing. And then if you use state power to kill them or push them out, then you've done a very similar act. And then of course against like disabled people too. It just seems like if you have when you consider what the Nazis were trying to do, it seems like you should have genocide protections probably for all of the specific people that they would have put in a concentration camp. Just like, hey, why did this person end up like? Oh, they were all this reason. And you're like, okay, well that should probably go into the statute to some degree.
Well, and the biggest sort of roadblock that actually has minor like validity in that I don't think that it would be okay, and I still think it should be a war crime, is that a political group is a voluntary group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's also one of the big things that sort of the courts have used to differentiate between a an eligible, I guess you could say, group for genocide and an ineligible group is the involuntary nature of it. In that, while obviously someone can proclaim, a heritage, um, if an opposition applies that heritage to you, um, it is not usually going to be that there's not usually going to be a choice for you. Whereas there is some argument that with a political group, um, because it's a voluntary thing, they aren't necessarily hunting you for an intrinsic part of yourself. And
I would even have
I
to
think
I would
that's
have to
being
push back
a
against
war
that
crime.
Well, I mean, not your definition. I would just have to push back against that idea because, like, it depends on kind of how extreme the political persuasion is. Obviously something like people for the if you're a part of a political group that's like people for the establishment of the Kentucky Indiana railway system. Obviously, that's something that's a little bit more leavable, and you might have joined. But like for some things, I feel like your political persuasions are sort of
Written on
unmovable
your
from you as a
body.
person, and
Yeah.
religion has proven one of the biggest things for ethnic cleansing is forced proselytation and forced conversion at the point of a sword. Now, the Muslims are notorious, and then the Christians following for being violent conversionists. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot of people that believe that religion, not because their ancestors had much of a choice in it. That's still an act of ethnic cleansing. So it's kind of crazy that you would extend that to religion, but not politics, especially if it's something that's not minor, like a politically held ideal. In America specifically, there are people that are born conservative. I know it doesn't seem like it, maybe because you don't really vote until you're 18, but every
I was
person
raised
I
in
know,
Missouri.
sorry,
Trust me, I know.
yeah, but for the case of the people listening,
Yeah.
um, almost every single person I know talks about how they were born in a liberal or conservative area. I'm from a blue state. That infers a level of ethnic relativity to your politics. Where I grew up, people didn't vote that way. Where I grew up, people didn't talk like that. Like, it seems an indelible part of an individual in an ethnic way. You might not be, if you're an ethnic. I'll say something that's not offensive, or I'm going to stumble over my own
A Romani
ethnicity.
person.
Would be I'm a German American Catholic from Cincinnati. I'm not Catholic. I don't practice. And I don't really have that strong of a heritage relative to Germany. I'm just from that part of Cincinnati. But if somebody started filling out a sheet, that's kind of where my background would lead. If you try, you can still include like the voting rates, of people that are in there too. I don't see, hey, your parents were voting like routinely conservative when you were born. We're going to put you on that list. I don't really see that big of a difference between the religion that I don't practice much and my parents' politics that I don't practice much. Really, I mean, I guess if you're highly dedicated to either thing, you might see them as more important. But as far as states rounding up people to get bullets put in them over large pits of lie and empty earth, I think it's a pretty good motivator.
Yeah, you've convinced me. I was not that firm on the position. Um, yeah, that was like I said, it was one where I was more iffy on if I thought that the distinguishing between them was really all that valid.
Hmm.
Um, but
No, I
yeah,
mean,
no, I
for
mean,
minor political things, maybe it's kind of like, but a lot of times that's really minor political things are the reasons we've had a lot of fucking pogroms and shit interpersonally. If
well,
you're
I
if
mean,
you're a
in the
Muslim looking into, say, the War of the Roses in England, and you don't know that much about Christianity, you might be like, "What? Christians are just killing Christians? What is going on here?" But like when you get down onto the ground, you're like, "Oh, this is just specific, literally political fights between two sects of a religious order." There's some aspects of the religion itself included, but a lot of this has to do with just the people themselves. I,
well, actually, something that I think might highlight what you're trying to get at very well is the incidents around Bleeding Kansas. I don't know how much you know about that.
that
Funny
sounds
enough, I
really
have
familiar, but I don't know.
I I I talked about it on a stream Colin the Demon Mama did a little while ago.
Hmm.
Um and it's funny, I don't know why I remember this, but I do remember that you were like in the like Discord shortly after I left. So it's possible you just like heard the tail end of me talking about it then.
Possibly.
Um but Bleeding Kansas, to make a long story very short, um when Kansas was first being settled by um, U.S. citizens, there was actually a rather large push by abolitionists from the East Coast to move there. That included John Brown. Um, and they did. They all moved and essentially created a free state, or, well, they were trying to create a free state in the very sort of testy waters being past the like Missouri Compromise line, essentially. But because they kept voting in for their constitution, when they voted on their constitution, they voted to have a free state. This caused essentially what I would call Missouri to commit like acts of terror.
Hmm.
They were guerrilla fighters who, and obviously there was like tit for tat kind of going on, but like John Brown and his company they were killing like people who were like slave catchers or like people attacking them. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, there were like towns burned down. Like there's a town that's now a ghost town in Kansas, as in no one lives there because it was burned down by these like Missouri people. And this was shortly before the Civil War. And
Yeah,
they
the states back
actually
then were very much more states' rightsy. They would fight each other. From what I
well no, I
understand, it was
mean
actually kind of common.
uh,
Um,
this was different. The federal government not only knew about it, but essentially sent sent people down into the area to like calm things down. But essentially, they were aiding and abetting the
mhm.
Missouri attack, like the Missouri militants. And there was actually a something that occurred in what was at the time the de facto capital of Kansas, Lawrence, where the Missouri like militants wound up like riding in and essentially like killing like bunch of people sort of indiscriminately. And then they like burned a newspaper business down and a bunch of like other places down too. And it was big news nationally. It actually even resulted in on the National Congress floor a Confederate, well, he died before the Confederacy, really. But would have been Confederate, like slave owning asshole to beat a an abolitionist senator near to death, just on the Congress floor.
Hmm.
Yeah, because that guy was like, "We need to help Kansas," essentially, like we need to do what's right.
That.
But yeah, so but I think that's very much sort of like a parallel in that when the when people were targeting those in Kansas, they weren't targeting, a ethnic group or a religious sect or anything other than a political group, but they wanted that political group exterminated.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so I just thought that might I just think that's probably the best example I can think of off the top of my head, certainly.
No, no, no. That makes sense. I think this is a good place to start trying to wrap it up a little bit. I gave you a good hour. This is a solid conversation. It does seem that a lot of the ICJ, UN, whatever and what have you, all the various different multi-state bodies that are deciding these things do seem like they want to have their cake and eat it too, kind of relative to who is giving them the money to do these sort of things, who's even signing on to be judged by it. And it was just a little bit of studying I've done on the Geneva Conventions themselves relative to warfare and such. It seems like it's all for the best that the conversation's at least happening at all. But I would say there is a lot of slack to be pulled out of the line, so to say, with the definitions and with the even approach to punishing these things. And you've helped illuminate a lot of stuff, especially holes in things that I hadn't considered, but do seem like they're pretty important. And this is a good conversation.
And
Literally not over because it never will, but I am going to have to
yeah.
wrap it up here if you don't mind. But if you want
Oh
to plug
yeah.
your socials, and of course, everybody, you can still talk to Ren in the Discord if you want to have any conversations about this. Go for it.
And I'll try to get a copy of my just the sort of articles and court cases that I was basing a lot of this on into the Discord. Is there a good place for me to put that? Like
Um,
like a channel or anything in
you can.
particular?
I think most of this conversation can just hop right into politics if you want to continue that
Okay.
stuff.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to give everyone like uh the sources I used.
Yeah,
But yeah, and is it okay if I just like have a wrap up finishing statement? I will make it short.
absolutely. Yeah, wrap it up. Hit your socials or how people can get in touch with you and say goodbye.
You got it. Um, but yeah, the biggest thing I sort of wanted to bring to light is that when you're talking to someone who is trying to say that what's going on in Palestine, you shouldn't call it a genocide. It's not a genocide. It doesn't meet the legal like definition. Is like instead of trying to argue with them that it does, point out that the legal definition itself is fundamentally broken. And in particular, when you can point it out as like that, certain people are excluded because they don't meet these four criteria. And like a lot of the sources I have talk about like the case law. So it's not just what's written on the page, it's what's like been determined in court. And it's pulling up those things that I think it might serve as a better argument than what I often see it going down as. Um, but yeah, and my socials, I don't, I
If you
have
don't have any
social.
or you don't want to share them, don't worry about it.
I literally, the Discord is probably the only way you are going to be able to reach me.
Perfectly fine.
Um, And if you do want to do that, my username is Ren Ophelia, but the O is actually a 0,
Yes.
and it's all lowercase.
Cool. Yeah, people are saying in chat, top tier Colin. Thank you, Rent. This is good. I always give people 15. I like literally, if you would have been bad, I would have pulled you off a little bit a while ago. But this is really good. So if you ever have anything you want to talk about again, hit me up. I'll try to make some time for you.
You got it, and thank you. It was lovely talking.
Thanks. Take it easy.
You too.
Well, thanks for everybody who pointlessly sat in on that in the thing stage. Ren, thank you again for stopping by. The conversation was not pointless. It was just funny that people were sitting in the stage trying to be like, "Hey, man, like, you got a second?" Like, no. It says literally talking to Ren. That was a good convo. If you ever want to try to talk to me, please hit me up about stuff. I have one other person that wants to talk about Warhammer 40K. I haven't forgotten about you if you're still in the audience. It's just a pain in the ass for me to schedule these things. But I want to try to get it in. If you ever want to do a debate, if whoever you are, debates, conversations, I really don't mind. If you guys say, people are like, Tyler, you didn't cut someone off immediately. Like, I don't. If the content's good or it's interesting, I don't stop people from talking immediately. And when I do, it's usually just for clarification. I like that. I like that information. I think that's a good conversation to be having too, relative to all the topics covered. I'm going to take a break. I need to take a break.
Hope you enjoyed your time on the west side. Don't forget to subscribe and like